Plaskett recently purchased a property on Lower Portland Street where he plans to open a new recording studio. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Plaskett on the construction of his new studio and recognize him for his commitment to the downtown Dartmouth area he calls home. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
The request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:57. We will finish at 3:57. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has a bad habit of overpromising, overhyping, and under-delivering when it comes to job announcements. Mr. Speaker, we've heard this government say 500 jobs at DSTN, 11,000 at Irving, 2,000 at Bowater, 1,400 in Port Hawkesbury, 280 at Scanwood. Mr. Speaker, that's 15,180 jobs promised. And what have we got from those 5 deals, Mr. Speaker? More than 1,300 layoffs, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, 5 deals that were supposed to create 15,180 jobs have resulted in 1,300 pink slips. Why have so many government deals gone bad?
Full Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is fabricating some of the numbers. That's simply not true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week alone, we had all Nova Scotians had cause to celebrate. We created nearly 1,000 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's a reason for all Nova Scotians to be proud. The only ones that aren't proud are the job killers sitting on the opposite side of the House.
Order, please. I'd remind the honourable member that fabricating the numbers is a little bit questionable around unparliamentary, so I'd ask the honourable member to retract that, please. Fabricating.
I will take that back, Mr. Speaker, and I'll substitute simply not true.
That's fine. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, $590 million for 1,300 pink slips. Talk about job killers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are now more Nova Scotians unemployed than during the recession. We've lost more than 3,000 full-time jobs since the NDP have taken office. Youth unemployment, Mr. Speaker, is up 20%. The only comfort this government has offered to 46,200 unemployed Nova Scotians is that jobs will come soon. Mr. Speaker, people are getting tired of this government's pointing to tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, they are suffering today. So my question for the minister, why has the government's job strategy only created part-time jobs in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through the Leader of the Opposition's own admission, one of the problems when we had a Liberal government in the province of Nova Scotia was they did not plan for the future, Mr. Speaker. A huge difference between then and now. We are planning for the future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that future seems like writing big checks, no job guarantees, and a lot of part-time work, Mr. Speaker, for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, too many Nova Scotians are struggling to make ends meet. Our taxes are the highest in the country. The Premier says, elect me and I'll fix that. Mr. Speaker, our power rates are the highest in the country. The Premier says, elect me again and I'll fix that too. Our economy has, Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, the worst economic growth in Canada. And again, Mr. Speaker, the Premier says things will get better after the next election. This government's economic development strategy, Mr. Speaker, has failed. and Nova Scotians are suffering now, Mr. Speaker, today. So my question for the minister, when will the government admit jobs here is a failed strategy, and when will they go back to the drawing board?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can stand in my place and I can say this. Do you know who's failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker? I know who's failed Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and it's sitting on the opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today it's being reported that the government is considering buying up to 550,000 acres of woodlands. Woodlands that, as recently as June, had an estimated value of $120 million. That's $120 million that could end up in the pockets of Resolute Forest Products Limited, Mr. Speaker. And so my question to the Premier is a simple one. Where will the Premier find the money for such a large purchase?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out in the past, there are certainly negotiations going on with Resolute. The question that is before us is not where the money will come from, but what will happen to 550,000 acres of forest land in our province in southwest Nova Scotia. Now, perhaps it would be the desire of the members opposite to have that to fall into the hands of a foreign company and have it stripped out and sent off shore without processing. But if that is the desire of the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia, just let the people of southwest Nova know.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we go again. Just like Muskrat Falls, where the Premier says the cost is not the issue, he now believes that $120 million purchase of land, the cost is not an issue either. Well, Mr. Speaker, for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, the cost of that land, just like Muskrat Falls, certainly is an issue for them. And like Muskrat Falls, the Premier is plunging down this expensive road without even considering the other options that are available to him. Because we can all share the goal of protecting that land, of making sure it's available to future generations of Nova Scotians, of making sure it's used in a responsible way. Purchasing is not the only option. There are many other ways of accomplishing that same objective that don't require another $100 million of debt. And so my question to the Premier is, has he looked at other options for accomplishing that same objective that don't involve adding another $100 million to our debt, and will he table them in the House today if he has?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, there have been a full examination of the assets of the company, including, as I said, the 550,000 acres of Nova Scotia woodlands that would be up for sale to a foreign company, and who then would be hostage to whoever that potential purchaser might be. And this, in fact, has been the way that things have been done in the past, Mr. Speaker. And I say to the House of Assembly, I say to the people of southwest Nova Scotia, I say to Nova Scotians that we are sick and tired of watching the future of Nova Scotia being sold off to foreign interests, and that day is over.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians are sick and tired of is a government that thinks the answer to every problem is to write a gigantic, great, big check with their money. That is what they are sick and tired of. And they're also sick and tired of a Premier who commits them to massive expenditures of money without looking at all his options. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is in this House of Assembly, we can decide to put that land to its highest and best use for all Nova Scotians without writing a big check. And so my question to the Premier is, will he look at the other options and bring them here for all Nova Scotians to see, instead of give another $100 million to Resolute Forest Products?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the leader of the Conservative Party that land, not only is it a resource that will generate every year stumpage, not only is it land that will be used for recreation for generations of Nova Scotians to come, but, Mr. Speaker, it is also about the future of the forestry sector. Now, back on August 27th, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table this. The leader of the Conservative Party, in an interview with CKBW, said 500,000 acres of prime Acadian forests are up for sale, and the government has no plan for that. I, am one of those people that believes it would be a real shame if all of that land were to fall into the foreign hands who have no interest in the long-term sustainability for our province, for our forests, Mr. Speaker. We thought we knew where he stood, but apparently we don't.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government signed a deal with Project, Mr. Speaker, to subsidize one business in a successful industry. The government promised this would create 440 jobs over 5 years. Mr. Speaker, we've heard this before. The government promised 500 jobs over 5 years with DSTN. This government committed up to $11.4 million in payroll rebates, Mr. Speaker, to this company. What is not clear is if the company will receive rebates for employees poached from other Nova Scotia businesses. So my question for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, a job poached is not a job created. Will projects receive a payroll rebate for employees taken from other Nova Scotia employers?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for years, we've stood in this House and we've heard complaints about out-migration. We've heard, even when we were in opposition, we had some concerns about out-migration. Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity here with projects. This was a Calgary-based firm. Mr. Speaker, what we are simply doing is the reverse of a trend that was employed by previous governments. We are bringing Calgary to Halifax, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, just let me. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if he believes what they write for, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to believe at some point with some of the stuff that comes out of that minister, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is wading into a thriving industry to grab headlines without considering the impacts, Mr. Speaker. Even in tough economic times, this industry has grown, and companies that already had a presence in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, are growing. The government picked one company, Mr. Speaker, over all of them. This government is trying to pick winners and losers without consulting the industry. So my question for the minister, why did this government give $11.6 million to one company in an already thriving industry without consulting those in other players?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this idea that we've got Calgary finally coming to Nova Scotia is going to give an opportunity for those Nova Scotians that are graduating from our universities to stay right here in the province of Nova Scotia. Also, Mr. Speaker, it's going to give an opportunity for those Nova Scotians that are out west to come back home, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Chamber of Commerces promote this activity. Mr. Speaker, and I've got to say, and someone in this House doesn't understand it, and those individuals aren't sitting on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, payroll rebates are paid in arrears. They are paid out as job numbers are achieved, Mr. Speaker. This is a way of doing business. We've done business for the good citizens of the province of Nova Scotia. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, we have to go around and fix some of the things that leader over there is trying to undo.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I hope those graduates that the minister is referring to aren't like those employees that he promised jobs at DSTN, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope they're not like the 1,400 people in the Strait area that were looking for work that this government promised, Mr. Speaker, which is evaporating, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope they're not like the 500 people in the South Shore, Mr. Speaker, whose jobs actually, Mr. Speaker, not only vanished, but Nova Scotia taxpayers' dollars went to Quebec, Mr. Speaker, to invest in a paper mill. That's what Nova Scotians are getting from this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and now, Mr. Speaker, what we have, Mr. Speaker, is a government taking tax dollars out of Nova Scotia companies and handing it over to a company from Calgary to compete directly against them for employment, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of economic development we have out of this, Speaker. Think about that for a second, Mr. Speaker. Hard-working Nova Scotians who've been building an industry, building an economy in the province of Nova Scotia, have their government turn around, take their tax dollars and give it to a firm in Calgary to compete directly against them, to take their employees, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, those aren't jobs being created, Mr. Speaker. Those aren't jobs being created, Mr. Speaker. Those are jobs being poached from hard-working Nova Scotia firms, Mr. Speaker. My question, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, why would the minister be so eager to invest in a Calgary firm instead of supporting hard-working Nova Scotia entrepreneurs?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this government is about creating jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I know, Mr. Speaker, that may be a foreign concept to members on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, I will read, and I'm going to table this.
Thank you.
And this is written by Scott Richards, who is president at Atlantic Region Projects. And I'm going to quote, Mr. Speaker, if I may. Not one employee of projects left their previous employer based on government support of projects because there hasn't been any government support in our first operation here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to table this, and what this does is this outlines a company who believes in Nova Scotia. A company from Calgary believes in Nova Scotia, unlike, Mr. Speaker, those members over there.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government says its deal with IBM will bring hundreds of good-paying jobs to Nova Scotia, and certainly we've heard that before. Governments in Queensland, New York, and Iowa have heard that as well, Mr. Speaker. In fact, IBM has a history of taking government money and failing to meet job targets. My question for the Economic Development Minister: why did this government sign a deal to make job promises with a company that has such a poor track record of meeting its obligations?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the opposition doesn't understand, Mr. Speaker, which we understand fully and Nova Scotians understand, with a company like IBM coming to the province of Nova Scotia is going to attract other companies. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand. I can't understand for the life of me why somebody would be against a progressive company. 500 jobs, Mr. Speaker. 500 jobs. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, it means a heck of a lot to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the minister that any single corporation of these large corporations that we've given money to, they'll all return and come to Nova Scotia for $100 million of taxpayers' money any day of the week. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, IBM does have a history of serious cost overruns. A deal between London's Driving Vehicle Licensing Agency and IBM promised $57 million in savings, Mr. Speaker. Instead, it saw overruns to the tune of $81 million. Given this government's program cuts and increasing deficit, we certainly cannot afford such a fiasco. The government already cut $65 million from education and $100 million from universities. So my question to the minister: what measures are part of the deal with IBM to recoup such cost overruns so students in Nova Scotia don't pay for the mistakes of the world's 9th largest corporation?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Again, and it's hard when you're asked questions and people just can't grasp can't grasp it. They don't understand, Mr. Speaker. Payroll rebates are paid in arrears. Once you reach the milestone, as it's recognized, it's done. It's done by an external audit, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things, these 500 jobs, these 500 IT jobs, which is a growing sector here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, which will provide employment for new graduates, for recent graduates from our institutions, Mr. Speaker. I can't for the life of me understand why the Liberal Party would be complaining about these jobs. Jobs for good Nova Scotians so they can stay here in Nova Scotia, so they can come back home to Nova Scotia, so they can raise their families here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. 500 jobs.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This contract, of course, was untendered, so we don't even know what kind of investigation was done before this decision was made. If the government had investigated, Mr. Speaker, it would have learned of the Queensland experience. Queensland decided to use IBM to create a new payroll platform involving SAP. The result? The agreement has been called a debacle, and it will cost at least $1.2 million or more to repair the faulty system by 2017. So my question to the minister, when it comes to time to pay for these cost overruns, who will the government side with? Students and their families, or the 9th largest corporation in the world?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, I'll break this down and make it a little bit more simple. With IBM, what we're going to have now, just listen up now. Now, what you have is you've got $50 million in payrolls. Do you know what that means to Nova Scotia? Do you know what that means? It's going to mean not only more jobs, not only more Nova Scotians staying here, Mr. Speaker, it's going to mean more money for education. It's going to mean more money for health. It's going to be more money for our roads. It's going to be more money for community services. Mr. Speaker, this is a sensible thing to do, but only a government with a vision would realize that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years since that bunch has been in, 7,400 Nova Scotians have lost their full-time jobs. And in the interest of accuracy, I will table the report from Statistics Canada that shows just that, 7,400 fewer full-time jobs. Mr. Speaker, during that same 3 years in the rest of Canada, the number of full-time jobs has increased by 688,400. Rest of Canada up 688,400. I'll table that in the interest of accuracy here in this House, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, spending $500 million on corporate welfare is not working for job creation in Nova Scotia when jobs here go down while jobs go up in the rest of the country. My question to the Minister of Economic Development, will he now abandon his corporate welfare spending spree since it is so clearly not working?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't so pathetic, it would be laughable. The simple fact of the matter is that the program, Nova Scotia Business Inc., which of course was instituted originally through the Conservative government of Dr. Ham, who has over the years operated to work to recruit business into the province. And in fact, I would point out to the leader of the Conservative Party, a company like RIM, which came to Nova Scotia. We're very happy to have them. 500 jobs. Simple fact of the matter is that they have had less people working now, but what that means is that they recover less in the way of payroll rebates because the jobs are actually tied to the rebates are actually tied to the jobs, and this means that these companies are essentially paid out of the money that they pay in payroll. So they get some of their own money back, and the balance of that goes to the people of Nova Scotia, as was pointed out by the Minister of Economic Development. It goes into new roads, it goes into payments for community services, it goes into health care, and it goes into education. Some of the $90 million that we have put into student assistance in the last number of years.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary. First.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am interested in the Premier's answer. I'm just not sure whose question he was answering, because that had nothing to do with my question to the Minister of Development about why 7,400 full-time jobs have disappeared in Nova Scotia, while the rest of Canada has been going up in full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. But that's not, of course, the end of the story. 2011 was one of the worst years in Nova Scotia history for out-migration. Worst year, in fact, in at least the last 25. At the same time, our economy, our GDP, went from the third best in the country when the NDP came in to one of the worst in the country, and I will table that report from Statistics Canada, again, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of accuracy. It appears that the only mess the NDP are trying to clean up is one of their own making. And so my question to the minister, or whoever over there wants to try and answer to it, is will they now, in the light of this evidence, stop their expensive corporate welfare spending spree and actually get on with the job of creating a few jobs in the province?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just so we understand, the Leader of the Conservative Party is dead wrong on all of those counts. First of all, there are 7,600 more jobs in Nova Scotia today than there were at the pre-recession peak, Mr. Speaker. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the worst years for out-migration in this province's history were 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, when the Progressive Conservative Party were in charge of the province. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, we have put an end to that.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apparently it's unparliamentary to say that someone is making something up, but perhaps it's not unparliamentary to actually invent your own statistics when you're answering a question, Mr. Speaker, because that is what we have just seen happen in this House. But I will go on, Mr. Speaker, because in addition to the job losses, which are measured by Statistics Canada, and in addition to the out-migration, which is measured by Statistics Canada, I happen to have the report on Nova Scotia's exports over the last 3 years, and guess what? They are down the most in all of Canada, over 16%, whether it's natural gas, whether it's lobsters, whether it's paper, whether it's anything else. The worst performance in the country, and I will table that report, and I hope the Premier takes the time to look at what Statistics Canada has to say about this province at some point. My final question to the Minister, or whoever over there wants to answer it, is will they now, in light of all this evidence, stop the expensive corporate welfare spending spree and get on with the job of actually creating a few jobs in Nova Scotia today? Thank you.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that rebates come out of the money that's actually paid by the company to us. They receive some of that back. That is, and maybe I need to explain the meaning of the word rebate to the Leader of the Conservative Party, but that's what a rebate is, Mr. Speaker. Simple fact of the matter is 7,600 more jobs in this province than there was at the pre-recession peak. And the other fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party left us with a $375 million deficit. Even the auditors afterwards said that that was on track for a $1.4 billion deficit if we continued down the track that the Tories were on. Mr. Speaker, their complaint is that we haven't cleaned up their mess fast enough.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. IBM just has a poor performance record similar to this government. Also, it has a habit of making deals behind closed doors. On March 19, 2012, the UK Observer reported that the British government and IBM agreed to change their initial agreement governing the control of personal, confidential information, Mr. Speaker. Both parties agreed, and in such, let personal, confidential information be stored offshore. My question for the Economic Development Minister: with IBM's pass, how can we be sure that this government will keep our personal, confidential information safe?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have the utmost confidence in IBM. Mr. Speaker, IBM is sworn by confidentiality. We have no concerns. We are proud. We are proud that we were able to form a partnership with IBM. Mr. Speaker, IBM could have chose to be anywheres in the world. Anywheres in the world. They could be in India. They could be somewheres in the U.S. They could be in other jurisdictions. They chose Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and this government is proud of that.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only does sending the stat offshore put security at risk, it also puts jobs at risk. UK Labour MP John McDonnell said, quote, UK Labour MP John McDonnell said, quote, despite all past promises by this government, the decision to offshore this sensitive information database will not only cost jobs, but open up vast opportunities for fraud, and end quote. We've signed a deal that does open vast opportunities for fraud and puts Nova Scotian jobs at risk. So my question to the Minister: how does the agreement with IBM ensure our data and Nova Scotian jobs will be safe and secure?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I will table this as well. Personal information protections with respect to provincial SAP services. Security features either reflect the province's current practices or enhance them. No personal information will leave Nova Scotia. It will remain on the servers that the province will continue to own and operate in its data center. The province determines what is considered. The province determines what is considered personal information. Such, for an example, addresses, banking information, social insurance numbers, etc. Any other data that may be shared for testing or quality assurance will be masked to protect personal and identifying information. Mr. Speaker, I will table that. Thank you.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question on this issue is about IBM changing the deal after the original deal is struck. Guarantees that the data will not be sent offshore. Guarantee that the jobs will not be sent offshore. Guarantee that this government will not enter into secret deals with IBM after the deal is signed. So again, I'll ask the Minister, will he guarantee that our information is safe and secure and Nova Scotians can count on our government standing up for the people and making sure the information is protected?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
What I will guarantee, Mr. Speaker, is that the protection of information will be the same, if not better, than what we currently have, Mr. Speaker. That's what I guarantee.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, 8,200 Nova Scotians between the ages of 15 and 24 have lost full-time employment since October of 2009. That's close to the same as the population of Sydney Mines. The loss of full-time employment for young men and women in Nova Scotia is almost 5 times the national average. Nova Scotians, of course, deserve better. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is, will the Minister admit his Jobs Where plan has failed young Nova Scotians, or will he continue to force our best and brightest to move away to make a decent living?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our track record will show that we are creating employment for Nova Scotians. We are creating an environment that will keep Nova Scotians here. Those recent graduates, with what we are doing, will not have to leave the province of Nova Scotia to go for employment in other jurisdictions around North America and around the world, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 7,600 new jobs have been created in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the jobs here strategy is working. We've proven that. Over 1,000, nearly 1,000 jobs last week alone. One of the most productive weeks. One of the most productive weeks in Nova Scotian history, Mr. Speaker. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, 11,500 jobs that will be created at the peak off the Irving Shipbuilding, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Total employment, full-time and part-time, for Nova Scotians aged 15 to 24 has dropped 9%. That's 9 times the national average. Meanwhile, 3,800 young Nova Scotians have left the labour force in the last 3 years. We are losing our young people because this NDP government, their failure to create jobs. Yesterday, or the other day, the minister stood on his feet and said it was a pleasure for him to boast about the things his government has done with respect to employment. Again, Nova Scotians deserve better. So my question to the minister, what will the minister tell the 8,200 young Nova Scotians who lost a full-time job, or the 3,800 young people who have left the as to why they cannot find a job?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I can remember 3 years ago when we first came into power, in the shape that this province was in. Mr. Speaker, there are more people working today than there were when we took over government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a strategy. Our strategy is working, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we need and what we should have for the benefit of all Nova Scotians is have that party over there get on board.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
So again, while we're talking about stats, Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate for young men ages 15 to 24 in Nova Scotia has gone up by 41.4% since October of 2009. Let me repeat, that's gone up by 41.4%. Unemployment for this age category is dropping in the rest of the country, but it's gone up 41.4% here in Nova Scotia. These young men are saving for college, finding their first career, are in the prime age for putting down roots here, but their unemployment rate has gone up by 41.4% under this government's watch. Nova Scotians deserve better. My question to the minister, Mr. Speaker, will the minister finally admit his plan has failed young Nova Scotians and that a 41% increase in the unemployment rate for young men is totally unacceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand the rationale here. Here we are. Last year we made this big announcement, nearly 1,000 jobs for Nova Scotians, and many of those jobs are going to be filled by young people. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, during the Liberal and the Conservative reign, 20 years, Nova Scotia was in what place? What place was Nova Scotia in 20 years? They were last, Mr. Speaker, dead last. We've taken that and we've turned the corner. We've turned the ship around, Mr. Speaker, something that they couldn't do in 20 years.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, almost a year ago, this NDP government offered up $90 million to Resolute. The Premier handed this money over to a corporation who in turn closed up shop and laid off Nova Scotians. This deal was no different than any of the other corporate handouts that the NDP have been so fond of. One of the most concerning aspects is the complete lack of transparency around this deal and subsequent deals to come. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Economic Development Minister is, when will the Minister be upfront with Nova Scotians and start opening the books on his multi-million-dollar deals?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. This government is more upfront than any other previous governments. We didn't sell Nova Scotia taxpayers on P3 schools, Mr. Speaker. That wasn't this government that has sold taxpayers on P3 schools. A problem that we've yet to see come to fruition. But when it does, Mr. Speaker, the debt that we've inherited as a result of P3s. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't this government that sold Nova Scotia Light and Power, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't this government that did all those silly things. We've got a plan, Mr. Speaker. Our plan is proven. I don't know how anyone can stand in this House, Mr. Speaker, and criticize a government for looking out for the future of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's easy to criticize this government on its lack of transparency, and that's what I'm trying to do right now. The NDP government has a track record of handing over hundreds of millions of dollars to large corporations without handing over any details of these contracts. It is essential that the terms and conditions of the large corporate deals that the NDP keep making be made known so that they can be debated in this House. Instead, there is a veil of secrecy over everything that the NDP government does. The Bowater deal was no different, and Nova Scotians have low expectations when it comes to transparency on the impending Resolute land deal to follow. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, why does the NDP government insist on signing multi-million-dollar deals without giving Nova Scotians the proper information and details?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, payroll rebates, once they are done, they're there for the public to look at. What we don't do, Mr. Speaker, and no government previous to us, we don't negotiate deals with the corporate community in public. Those are done behind doors. Once those deals are done, they're open. Once they're done, they become part of the public record. Mr. Speaker, we've stood here session after session and explained this to all honourable members of this House. Some people just refuse to understand it.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are watching their tax dollars leave this province. We saw it with the Resolute deal, and we're watching it happen again with DSME Trenton. What we've learned from the Bowater deal and what we've learned from the NDP is that the devil is in the details, and Nova Scotia taxpayers are too often left holding the bag. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, when will Nova Scotians see the NDP live up to the level of openness and transparency that they repeatedly,
after the next election, right?
Mr. Speaker, that they repeatedly called for when they were in opposition?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that reasoning is just not sound. You know, what we've done and what we do is we create jobs for Nova Scotians. We create employment, Mr. Speaker. They are going to get a salary. They're going to be paid a salary that's going to be spent. That's going to be spent here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. More tax revenue for the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not rocket science. However, they fail to understand it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, last week in this House, the Minister of ERDT said, Mr. Speaker, it's certainly a pleasure for me to rise on my feet and I can spend the rest of question period boasting about the good things this government has done when it comes to employment for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, not only is that insulting, Mr. Speaker, not only is that insulting, but it's offensive and it's blatantly incorrect. Nova Scotians deserve an economic development minister who will admit when he's wrong, and more importantly, a minister who knows what he's doing. And Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the minister finally admit things are going in the wrong direction under his watch and admit there's nothing to boast about in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I could stand here and I could tell you all of the offensive things that I've heard from that member coming from the opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. The member doesn't understand about the investments that we made and Bill did it. He doesn't know, doesn't recognize the PIP, the Productivity Investment Program, Mr. Speaker, that we've made investments in every corner of the province of Nova Scotia. Good investments, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, investments that are paying off. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's shameful that that the third party, after what they did to the province of Nova Scotia, would get up on their seat and hurl insults around such as that, Mr.
Speaker. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Speaker, last week this minister said, this government has protected jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. Yet Cape Breton has an unemployment rate of 16.4%. That's 16.4% unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker. The second highest unemployment rate in all regions of this country. With a protector like that, who needs enemies? Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit today that his protection is driving up unemployment in Cape Breton, and will he admit he's just not up to the job?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government knows full well where it stood with respect to New Page. Mr. Speaker, we were the first ones there. 1,400 jobs that we protected in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. 1,400 jobs, Mr. Speaker, that we made investments in so that they could stay here, Mr. Speaker, raise their families here, Mr. Speaker, and have a good quality of life. Mr. Speaker, not to mention Teltec, another company that this government has invested in. Bill did it. Mr. Speaker, there are countless companies in not only in mainland Nova Scotia, but certainly in Cape Breton that we've invested in because we believe in Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know where the third party was when it came to New Page, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Premier said job growth is going in the right direction. When comparing October 2009 to October 2012, Cape Breton's employment rate has decreased. Employment decreased by 1,800 jobs, approximately 500 full-time jobs lost, and approximately 1,200 part-time jobs lost. Mr. Speaker, if job growth is going in the right direction, which direction does the minister think is right?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one thing I do know for sure is that Nova Scotia is the leading province in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to opportunities and job creation. We are number one.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think Nova Scotians, my question's for the Minister of Natural Resources, and I think people can be forgiven if they're a bit suspicious when the government says there's a good deal coming with respect to Resolute or Bowater. I think we all remember the postcard the Premier and the member for Queens sent out that said a 5-year deal brightens prospects on the South Shore, enhance the long-term sustainability of the paper mill. You know, protecting 2,000 jobs, good job. We've spoken to a number of people who are still waiting for the apology for that one. You know, Mr. Speaker, last week the member for Queens introduced a late debate topic about the expected sale of the timberlands, and yet the fact is, Mr. Speaker, the government wouldn't provide any details so that the parties could actually debate and discuss that. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Natural Resources please tell us when this expected deal will be announced and whether he plans to bring it before the House so it can be properly examined?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Certainly, the Bowater situation is very important to this province, and we've been in good faith negotiations with Resolute, and in addition to that, we spent considerable time on the South Shore consulting with sawmillers and woodlot owners and workers, environmental groups, MTRI, a whole lot of very important people there in the South Shore. And we're there to protect good jobs, to move forward with new and innovative ways to do forestry in this province, and to ensure that workers and their families can remain and prosper here in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister just stood and said that they're still going through good faith negotiations, yet the member last week from Queens stood and said that this is a great deal, so either the deal is done and it can be tabled before the House, or the member misled the House last week and by suggesting that it's a good deal, because unless the deal is done, you can't know if it's good or bad. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why he can't release the details of the deal now if his colleague already seems to know enough to argue that it's a good deal?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as I mentioned, we are in good faith negotiations with Resolute, and we're looking at all possible options for the assets of that company, and including the 550,000 acres. We're looking to moving forward, to support the forest industry, to support other wildlife and recreational needs. Really the needs of the community and the workers, and in due course, the details will be made available.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the minister saying due course the details will be released. We read reports today it might be around Christmas, kind of the way the boundary review was done as a Trojan horse around Christmas. You know, Mr. Speaker, last week the member for Queens stood and said it's a good deal. The minister now says, well, we're looking at all possibilities and we're negotiating in good faith. Mr. Speaker, this is a bit confusing that one member says it's a good deal, suggesting it's done, and the other member says they haven't finished it, so he doesn't know. Well, so Mr. Speaker, let's make this simple. Will the minister commit to the House that he will release the deal with Resolute Forest Products in full well before the legislature rises so it can be examined by the legislature?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It takes time to get things right. I just would ask for the honourable member to have patience, and again, we're working to get the best possible deal for Nova Scotians, for the workers and their families and the communities along the South Shore. 2,000 workers, and the spin-off will be of real great benefit to all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to a question on November 6th to the Minister of Education regarding the number of students in our schools who have identified special needs, the Minister responded, and I will quote and table, "The information that is being requested is information that I will need to ask the boards to supply to the Department of Education." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, we know the information is already available at the department, and it's appalling to think that this minister does not know that. So my question to the minister, will the minister table the information today?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I always find it confusing when a question is asked that the honourable member knows the answer to already. She is very well aware, Mr. Speaker, that the information for specific well, we live in Nova Scotia and we don't label our children with specific needs within our school system. I can say how many children are on IPPs or have modifications, but we don't track exactly children with special needs. They do that in the United States. We don't do that here in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I find it a bit strange to think that that's language that the minister doesn't want to use. However, she talks about funding for special needs children, so I'm confused. Mr. Speaker, all school boards were asked to complete a survey regarding students in their schools with identified special needs, and that came from the Department of Education, of which this minister is responsible. And that survey included students with IPPs, students on resource, students in learning centres, students receiving special services through speech-language pathologists and school psychologists. And, Mr. Speaker, the deadline for that survey to be completed and returned back to the department was June of 2012. That's 5 full months ago. So obviously, Mr. Speaker, the minister hasn't reviewed the information that she asked for 5 months ago. So my question to the minister is this: how can parents, students and teachers have any confidence that the minister understands the needs of their students when she has admitted she doesn't even know the information was requested and she hasn't been able to table it, and it's been there 5 months?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have been listening to parents and to school boards about funding for students in our schools that have specific needs. We listened very carefully, and in our budget, we increased that protected budget line by $13 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister doesn't seem to know the information that she asked for. She doesn't know if it's been submitted. She didn't know what the numbers were, and obviously hasn't been able to use them for future planning. The minister talks about more funding to special needs students, and I applaud the government for that. I would also, however, ask the minister, how can you build a budget to provide services and supports for students when you don't even know how many people you're planning for?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member would know that we work very closely with school boards, and they present us with the needs that they need each year, and we put that in our budget. And we actually listen to our school boards and to our parents and respond appropriately. Unlike when I was in education, and I think the honourable member would remember this. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to speak. I'm having some trouble hearing here. When I was a teacher and the honourable member was a teacher, she remembers very clearly that when the Liberals were in power, that they actually broke our collective agreement, rolled us back by 3% over a 3-year period. And talking about students and students with special needs, they sent teachers home for 5 days. And when the teachers were home, the children did not get the education they needed and deserved.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. This government refuses to take action on the use of ankle bracelets for patients on unescorted leave from the East Coast Forensic Hospital. Despite pleas from victims' families, they will not even consider it. They will keep them waiting. We do not believe this is a responsible approach for the government to take. My question: what assurance has the minister given the family of Raymond Tavel that he has given their suggestions serious consideration?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I see that the Conservative Party is trying to play in the plight of a family that is suffering from a very grievous loss. And I want to assure the party, the third party there, that I have read the documents, that I've heard their concerns. I've also looked at the 18 recommendations that the committee has put forward that did the analysis on the matters surrounding the forensic hospital and the sudden death that occurred, and that we're taking those seriously and moving them forward. What the Conservative Party would like to do is treat mental illness as though it is a crime, and that in itself is a crime.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister will remember that our difficulty with the 18 recommendations in the report is that there was no focus on public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has kept people waiting on every level. Thousands of people are waiting for full-time employment. They're waiting for lower power bills. They're waiting for long-term care and surgeries. The family of Raymond Tavel has made a very legitimate and heartfelt plea to the government. They do not deserve to be ignored. Keeping people safe should be a priority of any government. My question to the minister: why won't the minister listen to those who have been affected by his inaction and examine the use of ankle bracelets to protect both patients and the public?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you. Unlike the member that's raising the question, I spent a lifetime in public safety and take the matter very seriously. I put my career there. In addition, this government takes public safety seriously. And I'm very proud to say that I have the utmost confidence in the court system and to the judiciary, unlike the Conservatives that allude that they do not know how to make sound judgments as to who should or shouldn't receive ankle bracelets. I, too, have respect for our probation officers and our correctional service officers who provide a high-quality service, unlike the Conservative Party, who do not trust their judgment. I, too, respect the police officer and the frontline workers. They do great work, and I just wish the Conservative Party would give them the respect that they deserve.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, it's funny how times change. I spoke to a lot of law enforcement officers who really appreciated the Boots on the Street program. But when this former police officer becomes the Minister of Justice, what does he do? He cuts that program. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of law enforcement officers across this province that told me they did not appreciate that. They talked about the good work that program did right in the schools, getting police officers into the schools to help young people, especially young people at risk. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think I'm running out of time. I think I've made my point, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The time allotted for questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Okay. Thank you. Do you want to do an introduction first before I do? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I'm calling government bills for second reading.
Government bills for second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 119, the Cosmetology Act.
Bill number 119, the Cosmetology Act. I'm now going to recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery. Mr. Speaker, we have with us today members of the Pictou County Injured Workers Association who were holding an information picket outside coming across when members were coming into the House, Mr. Speaker, and they're asking government to hold